There is a moment in Scripture that most preachers skip over entirely, not because it is unimportant, but because it is almost too specific, too precise, too geographically intimate to feel like prophecy at all. It reads more like a news report than an ancient oracle. And yet it was written more than 500 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. The moment is found in the 14th chapter of the book of Zechariah, and it contains a detail so particular, so historically verifiable, and so theologically loaded that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Zechariah did not merely describe the return of the Lord in general, atmospheric language, the kind of sweeping apocalyptic poetry that leaves interpretation wide open. He named a mountain. He named a direction. He described the physical transformation of the land. He specified who would be standing where and what their feet would touch. And he did all of this in a manner that no other prophet of the Hebrew canon, not Isaiah in his soaring heights, not Daniel in his visionary depths, quite matched in its crystalline, terrestrial precision. That is the detail nobody talks about, and it changes everything. To understand why Zechariah's vision stands apart, one must first understand who Zechariah was and the world into which his prophecies were born. He was the son of Berechiah and grandson of Iddo, as identified in Zechariah 1:1, and descended from a priestly line, for the house of Iddo is listed among the priestly families in Nehemiah 12:16, and he prophesied during the same turbulent post-exilic period as Haggai in the 2nd year of Darius the king. The Jewish people had returned from Babylon. Jerusalem lay largely in ruins. The temple, the beating heart of all Jewish national and religious identity, had not yet been rebuilt. The community was exhausted, demoralized, and dangerously tempted toward a spiritual pragmatism that asked whether God had truly not abandoned them. It was into this precise atmosphere of theological doubt and national fragility that the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, not in the form of comfort alone, but in the form of vision, vast and intricate, layered with imagery that would take centuries to fully decode. 8 night visions, oracles, and a prophetic climax that brings the entire narrative of redemption to a specific, literal, geographical conclusion. That conclusion is what this study is about. Isaiah, without question, saw the Messiah with remarkable clarity. From the tender shoot rising from the stump of Jesse in Isaiah 11:1 to the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, who bore our griefs and carried our sorrows, to the glorious proclamation of Isaiah 9:6. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Isaiah painted the person of Christ with breathtaking definition. But when Isaiah turned his prophetic gaze toward the end of all things, he tended toward the cosmic and the universal. He described new heavens and a new earth in Isaiah 65:17. He spoke of nations streaming to the mountain of the Lord in Isaiah 2:2-3. He used the language of transformation and glory, of the knowledge of the Lord, covering the earth as waters cover the sea, as recorded in Isaiah 11:9. These are magnificent, luminous images, but they are panoramic, they are wide-angle. They do not give you a set of coordinates. Daniel, for his part, was the master of apocalyptic architecture. In his visions recorded across the second half of his book, Daniel saw the succession of world empires, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, as a great statue struck by a stone cut without hands, as documented in Daniel 2:34-35. He saw the Ancient of Days seated on a throne of fire, and one like the Son of Man, coming in the clouds of heaven to receive an everlasting dominion, as described in Daniel 7:9-14. He received the astonishing 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9:24-27, a chronological framework that, properly understood, pinpoints the very timing of the Messiah's arrival and rejection. Daniel gave the church something Isaiah did not, a prophetic calendar. But even Daniel, for all the mathematical and structural precision of his visions, did not tell you where to stand on the day of the Lord. He told you when. He told you who would be reigning and who would be defeated. But the geography of the final moment, the precise physical location where history turns its last great corner, was not Daniel's to give. That was Zechariah's. Open the 14th chapter of Zechariah and read it slowly, because every sentence carries weight. The chapter begins with a declaration of apocalyptic intensity. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, as written in Zechariah 14:1. The prophet then describes a siege of Jerusalem, a city taken, houses rifled, women ravished, and half the city going into captivity, as detailed in Zechariah 14:2. The darkness of this opening is not decorative. It is historically calibrated to the vulnerability of Jerusalem as a city that had been conquered, sacked, and divided more times than almost any other metropolis in the ancient world. Zechariah was speaking to people who knew exactly what siege warfare looked like. They had lived through Babylon. They understood what it meant for walls to fall and populations to be scattered. He was not trafficking in metaphor. He was telling them that before the final dawn, there would be one more night. And then comes verse 3, and the entire atmosphere of the text shifts. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle, as recorded in Zechariah 14:3. The language here draws directly from the great traditions of Yahweh as divine warrior, the God who went before Israel as a man of war, as Moses sang in Exodus 15:3. The reader who knows the Hebrew scriptures immediately recognizes the pattern: judgment, crisis, divine intervention, redemption. But Zechariah does not leave the intervention vague. He does not say the Lord will appear in glory in the heavens, or that fire will come down from above, or that a great light will shine from the east. He says something far more startling. He names a mountain. He names a direction. He describes a physical, geological event. And that, precisely, is the detail that separates Zechariah from every other prophetic voice. Zechariah 14:4 declares, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley. And half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south." Read that again. His feet, the Mount of Olives, on the east, a valley opening in the midst. This is not allegory. This is not poetic language standing in for a spiritual principle. This is a prophecy that specifies terrain. The Mount of Olives is a real ridge of limestone hills running approximately 2.7 kilometers north to south, situated directly to the east of the old city of Jerusalem, separated from the Temple Mount by the Kidron Valley. Zechariah is not describing a symbolic mountain. He is describing a known topographical feature that every inhabitant of Jerusalem could see from the city walls. And he is saying that the feet of the Lord will stand on it. The theological weight of this specificity is difficult to overstate. In the entire prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible, the language of God's feet touching the earth carries enormous significance. When the Psalms describe the Lord descending, they often use language of clouds and darkness, of fire going before him, as in Psalm 97, 2-3. When Ezekiel saw the glory of the Lord departing from the temple in Ezekiel 10:18-19, it departed through the east gate. Then, as recorded in Ezekiel 11:23, the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood upon the mountain which is on the east side of the city, the Mount of Olives. And in Ezekiel 43:2-4, the glory returns through that same eastern gate. There is a trajectory in the prophetic geography of Jerusalem that makes Zechariah's precision not arbitrary, but profoundly intentional. The glory left through the east. It returns through the east. It departed over the Mount of Olives. It returns to stand upon the Mount of Olives. The symmetry is not accidental. It is the architecture of divine redemptive history. Now consider what the New Testament does with this information. In Acts 1:9-12, the disciples are standing on the Mount of Olives watching Jesus ascend. The text records that a cloud received him out of their sight. And then two men in white apparel tell the disciples, "Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken up from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven." And then Luke adds with deliberate geographical precision, "Then returned they unto Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is from Jerusalem a Sabbath day's journey." The location of the ascension is identified. Jesus left from the Mount of Olives. The angelic announcement is that he will return in the same manner he left. Zechariah had told them, 5 centuries earlier, exactly where his feet would land. The disciples were standing on the very ground that Zechariah had designated. Whether they understood this connection in that moment is impossible to know. But the Holy Spirit, who inspired both Zechariah and Luke, clearly wanted the reader to connect the departure point with the return point. The mountain is the same mountain. This is the detail nobody talks about. Preachers quote the angelic promise of Acts 1:11. Commentators discuss the ascension theology of Luke Acts. Prophecy teachers point to Zechariah 14 in the context of the tribulation and the nation's siege of Jerusalem. But very few stop to place these texts in direct conversation and ask the question that their juxtaposition demands. Why did God choose to tell his people through a minor prophet writing in the rubble of post-exilic Jerusalem the exact geographical coordinates of the second coming? Why was it important that the returning Lord would not merely appear in a cloud, not merely be seen from afar, but that his feet would touch a specific ridge of limestone east of the city? The answer opens into some of the most profound themes in all of Scripture. The first dimension of the answer has to do with the theology of the body. Throughout Scripture, the incarnation is not incidental to God's redemptive plan. It is central to it. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, as John 1:14 declares. The resurrection is not spiritual only, it is bodily, as Paul argues at length in 1 Corinthians 15, insisting that if Christ is not risen bodily, faith is vain, and the preaching is empty. The ascension is bodily. Jesus went up in the same body he inhabited on earth, the same body that bore the wounds of Calvary, the same body that ate fish with the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias after the resurrection, as recounted in John 21:9-14. And the return, Zechariah tells us, is bodily. His feet will stand, not a vision, not a spiritual manifestation. Feet. The very embodied physicality of the return is embedded in the prophecy. Zechariah's precision is not geographic for the sake of geographic detail. It is geographic because embodied persons occupy specific places. The returning Lord is not a force, not an abstraction, not a spiritual energy. He is a person, and persons stand somewhere. The second dimension concerns the redemptive geography of Jerusalem itself. The city of Jerusalem in Jewish theological understanding is not merely a capital city in the political sense. It is the place where heaven and earth meet, the site of the temple, the dwelling place of the divine name. The Jewish concept of centrality and divine focus on the land, reflected in Ezekiel 38:12, where the people of Israel are described as those who dwell in the midst of the land, pointed to a theological cosmology in which this city and this people occupied a unique position in the created order. The Mount of Olives, standing immediately to the east, directly across the Kidron Valley from the eastern gate of the Temple Mount, was not merely a convenient hill. It was the place from which the glory of God departed in Ezekiel's vision, as seen in Ezekiel 11:23, where the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood upon the mountain which is on the east side of the city. The return to the Mount of Olives in Zechariah 14:4 is therefore not a random choice. It is the retracing of the steps of divine departure. The glory that left will return by the same road. The exile of divine presence will be reversed at the very site of its withdrawal. The third dimension is pastoral and concerns the people of Jerusalem themselves. Zechariah 14:5 describes the inhabitants of Jerusalem fleeing through the valley that will be created by the splitting of the Mount of Olives, finding an escape route that the geological transformation will open. The Lord who splits the mountain does so in part to provide a way out for his people. This is consistent with the character of God throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. The God who opened the Red Sea when Israel had nowhere to go in Exodus 14. The God who stopped the Jordan River when Israel needed to cross in Joshua 3. The God who always makes a way when there appears to be no way. Even in the apocalyptic drama of the final siege and divine intervention, there is a pastoral tenderness in the geography. The mountain splits, and the people have a valley through which to flee. Judgment and mercy are intertwined in the very topography of the last day. It is also worth noting what Zechariah says happens after the feet of the Lord stand on the Mount of Olives. Zechariah 14:6-7 describes a unique day in which the light will not be clear or dark, a day known only to the Lord, in which at evening time it shall be light. This language has challenged interpreters for centuries, but its essence points to a transformation of the natural order itself, not mere meteorological change, but a restructuring of the relationship between light and darkness that has governed creation since Genesis 1:3-5. The very physics of evening and morning will be altered. Zechariah 14:8 then describes living waters going out from Jerusalem, half toward the former sea and half toward the hinder sea, in summer and in winter. This is the river of life that flows from the throne, anticipated again in Ezekiel 47:1-12, and fulfilled in the vision of Revelation 22:1-2, where John sees a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. Zechariah saw it all. He saw the physical arrival, the geological transformation, the cosmic light shift, and the life-giving river. He saw the second coming not as a distant abstraction, but as a cascade of specific, connected, theologically coherent events that begin with 2 feet on a mountain east of Jerusalem. And then Zechariah 14:9 delivers the culminating proclamation, "And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one." This verse, saturated with the language of Jewish monotheism and resonant with the Shema of Deuteronomy 6:4. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord," declares that the second coming is not merely a rescue operation. It is the universal establishment of the undivided, uncontested reign of God over all creation. The fragmentation of human allegiance that has characterized history since Eden, the worship of many gods, the divided loyalties, the competing empires of men and demons, will end. One Lord, one name, one King. The fractured cosmology of a fallen world will be gathered back into the unity that was always its intended destiny. Isaiah saw this universal reign. He saw it in broad strokes of breathtaking beauty. Daniel saw the kingdom of the Ancient of Days, consuming all earthly kingdoms, but neither of them told you that it begins when feet touch the Mount of Olives. Neither of them gave you the physical trigger point of history's last great act. That was Zechariah's gift to the church, not a lesser vision, but a more precise one. a vision that gives the returning king not merely a role in the drama, but a mark on the map. This matters enormously for the way Christians pray, hope, and orient their spiritual lives. The second coming in Zechariah is not an escape from history, but a transformation of it. The Lord does not return to a different planet, to a non-physical realm, to a purely spiritual dimension beyond geography. He returns to this earth, to this city, to this mountain. The physicality of the promise is the promise of physical renewal. As Paul would later write in Romans 8:19-21, the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. The creation is waiting. The mountain is waiting. The valley that will open is already there, in geological form, awaiting its prophetic purpose. Geologists have long noted that the Mount of Olives sits on a fault line, and while this observation does not diminish the supernatural character of Zechariah's prophecy, it is a remarkable reminder that the physical world into which God spoke this word was already prepared from the moment of creation to receive the fulfillment. There is one more dimension that must not be overlooked, and it is perhaps the most personally searching of all. Zechariah 12:10, which belongs to the same prophetic complex as chapter 14, contains a verse that the New Testament returns to repeatedly. "And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him, as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him, as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn." John 19:37 cites this verse in connection with the soldier piercing Jesus' side at the crucifixion. Revelation 1:7 cites it again in the context of the second coming. "Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him." The second coming is, among other things, a moment of recognition. The one who was pierced will be recognized as the one who was pierced. The wounds that Thomas demanded to see in John 20:27 will be visible to every eye. And the mourning of Zechariah 12:10, the deep, personal, inconsolable mourning of recognition, like the mourning for a firstborn son, will be the response of those who finally understand who they see. This is the theological depth that runs beneath the geographic surface of Zechariah 14. It is not merely a prophecy about where Jesus will land, it is a prophecy about who will be seen when he arrives. The return to the Mount of Olives is the return of the one who left from that same mountain, having been betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane at the foot of that mountain as recorded beginning in Matthew 26:30-36, having prayed there in an agony that produced sweat like drops of blood as recorded in Luke 22:44, having wept over Jerusalem from its crest in Luke 19:41. The mountain that heard his prayer in Gethsemane will feel his feet at his return. The geography is not incidental. It is memorial. It is the landscape of his suffering and the location of his triumph, and they are the same place. For the Christian who reads Zechariah carefully, the effect should be a kind of holy vertigo, the dizzying sensation that the specificity of God's promises means that nothing in the redemptive plan is vague or approximate. God does not promise in generalities what he intends to fulfill in particulars. He named a mountain because he will stand on that mountain. He named a direction because the glory departs and returns from that direction. He described a geological transformation because the earth itself will bear witness to the moment. The same God who told Abraham that his descendants would leave Egypt after 400 years in Genesis 15:13 is the God who told Zechariah that the returning Lord would touch the Mount of Olives and split it east to west. Prophecy in the Bible is not wishful thinking or pious aspiration. It is the advance publication of what God has already determined to do. Isaiah wrote of the suffering servant and saw him lifted high in a vision that the Spirit gave him. Daniel received the architecture of kingdoms and their succession in dreams and visions that taxed his physical strength, as described in Daniel 8:27. Both of them were giants of prophetic vision, towering figures in the spiritual literature of humanity. But Zechariah was given something different, not a more exalted vision, but a more granular one. He was given the coordinates, he was given the landmark. He was given the detail that, when matched against the narrative of the Gospels and the promise of Acts 1, creates an interlocking precision that can only be explained by the superintendence of one divine mind over centuries of prophetic disclosure. It is worth pausing here to consider what it meant for Zechariah's original audience to receive this kind of prophecy. They were a community living in the shadow of profound disappointment. They had returned from Babylon with enormous expectations. The prophets who preceded the exile, Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, had spoken of a glorious restoration in which the nations would stream to Zion, the Davidic king would reign in righteousness, and the covenant people would dwell securely in their land. But what they found when they returned was a ruined city, a half-built temple, hostile neighbors, and a Persian imperial administrator standing between them and any meaningful self-determination. The gap between prophetic promise and lived reality was not a theological abstraction for these people. It was the texture of every day. Zechariah's visions, including the 8-night visions of the early chapters, were precisely calibrated to address this gap, not by diminishing the promise, but by insisting that the promise was still operative, still true, still moving toward its fulfillment, even when the evidence around them suggested otherwise. This is why the specificity of Zechariah 14 is not incidental to its pastoral purpose. A vague promise of eventual restoration might have been somewhat comforting, but a promise that names the mountain, that describes the valley, that coordinates the return of the Lord with the topography they walked past every day, that is a different kind of promise entirely. That is a promise that embeds itself in the visible world and says, "Look at that ridge over there, the one your children play near, the one you can see from the temple courts. That ridge is in the prophecy. The Lord who is coming will stand on it. And because the Lord will stand there, history is not a chaos of meaningless suffering. It is a corridor leading somewhere specific, and the specific destination has already been named. This pastoral dimension of prophetic geography should not be minimized by modern readers who are perhaps too accustomed to a spiritualized Christianity that tends to relocate all divine activity to an inner, invisible realm. The incarnation itself was a protest against disembodied religion. God did not send a concept or a feeling to save humanity. He sent his Son, in flesh, to a specific location, born in Bethlehem as prophesied in Micah 5:2, raised in Nazareth, ministering primarily in Galilee, dying in Jerusalem, rising from a tomb outside the city walls. Every act of redemption was placed somewhere on the map. Zechariah's precision belongs to this same insistence that God's saving activity is always particular before it is universal, always local before it is cosmic, always embodied before it is glorified. The church that reads Zechariah 14 should come away with its eschatological hope sharpened, not softened. The return of Christ is not a vague spiritual event waiting to be spiritualized into comfortable imprecision. It is a concrete, geographical, bodily, geological, historically verifiable in advance event toward which all of history is moving. The feet that walked the roads of Galilee will stand on the Mount of Olives. The hands that bless the children will be seen by every eye. The name that is one will be confessed over all the earth, and the living waters will flow from Jerusalem east and west to heal a world that has been waiting for its king. If you have been moved by this study of Zechariah, and the astounding specificity of what God revealed through this prophet. Leave a comment below. Tell us where in the world you are watching or reading from, your city and your country. You are part of a global community of believers who are looking at the same horizon, waiting for the same king, standing on the same promise. Write it below and let us see how far this word has reached.